Just a little bit of background. I'm a nurse and midwife, my colleague, esteemed colleague here. And following that, I segued into working on the issue of gender-based violence for almost 12 years. Having come face to face with the sexual violence within the conflict in Darfur in 2005, I arrived at a point where I could no longer journey through life without actually taking it on, learning about it, and trying to become some way equipped to support and reach out to survivors of gender-based violence. And it's in this role now that I'm stepping back and bringing my kind of HIV knowledge through my health background back to play. So I am very new to the area of HIV, but life is a journey of learning, so I'm looking forward to it. Durban in 2016 was my first time to interface with an international AIDS conference, and boy was I blown away. The power of the solidarity and the movement that is the movement that has come to address the issue of HIV/AIDS was just so powerful for me as someone stepping into it. Having worked in gender-based violence, I obviously come from a very strong women's movement where solidarity is a key pillar of everything that we do, but I was very, very struck by that. And very much for me, throughout my time in Durban, was this sense of reflecting back on where we first began to hear about HIV. So I really found myself going under on this journey of the last 30 or so years, and you know, the power in how far we've come and the energy that we need to take from those spaces to go the next distance was very, very powerful for me. On one of the days, we met with the Irish ambassador, who's based in Pretoria, and just by pure chance, after meeting with him, he had been invited to do a talk at a place outside of the main kind of conference centre, and we said, yeah, you know, we'll go along. And we actually ended up in what was called the HIV/AIDS Living Museum. And it was really just an amazing place, because what it did was it took everyone that came in those doors on that journey as to where we'd come. And the AIDS conference had been held in Durban in 2000 as well, and that was a key turning point in the movement to address HIV/AIDS. So there was that really strong sense throughout the whole time of everybody reflecting back. In the Living Museum, I connected back in with two people who of course I was familiar with, but I had forgotten them in my mind. And they were two amazing people who did much in their shoes as advocates. And one was Gugu Dalimi, a young woman who lived in a slum just outside of Durban. And she disclosed her HIV status early on, and she spoke out publicly about being a woman living with HIV. And as a result of her disclosure, there was violence committed against her by her community, and 4 men in her community murdered her. The Living Museum has set up a whole section that actually her daughter, who was 7 at the time of her mother's murder, has grown into this amazing advocate. And she set up a foundation in her mother's name, and she works with young children who are living positively with HIV in the community in which her mother was murdered. She lives and works out of the house that she shared with her mother. But everything that threaded itself through that story was about the stigma and the discrimination that people experienced when they were identified as living, the strength that it took to step out and to speak publicly, and the risk that people took at times in doing so, and the risk very, very strongly in this case being brought home to bear for all of us. The other person that I reflected back on was Nkosi Johnson, a young boy who spoke at the opening of the Durban conference in 2000 and called very strongly on the international world to get off the fence and to do something. And the words he spoke were about how, as a young boy, and it was all very much around stigma as well, you know, play with me. You know, I know that if I fall and cut my knees, to seek an adult out and to help with that. But you can't get HIV from shaking my hands, from being friends with me, from hugging me. So that's where where we were, and just the real sense of that. I mean, in everything that I do in my work, I think coming back to the person is so important, and you won't hear me quoting statistics and science, and yes, it's all really important and it has a very valuable place. But when we come to talk about HIV or gender-based violence, we're talking about people. We're talking about their lives, and how this piece fits for them in their lives, and for us as people. And it's not just about people living with HIV, but all of us have a role to play in this. So that was just really, really strong, you know, reflections from me. The museum then took us on a journey into the whole development of the science, which I took pictures of, and we'll collate as a PowerPoint slide at some point in time. But I could see a whole training in it. I was like, oh, I have to train everyone now. That was the other thing that happened when I was in Germany, and I have to train everyone. So that gives a little bit of sense myself. The other big reflection I had stepping into that space as someone who has worked in the space of gender inequality and gender-based violence was a very keen and sharp awareness that we need to be very mindful that what we ask for and seek in one space does not impact negatively on another space. So what we're calling for in terms of things to reduce vulnerability to HIV, AIDS, let's try to be sure that that doesn't increase vulnerability to gender-based violence. And, you know, one example that I would come to on that is things like, you know, practices isn't quite the right word, but perhaps, you know, living in cultures or contexts where after the delivery of a baby, where it's acceptable for a woman not to be sexually available to her partner for a time, and then that then becoming, well, if you're not available, then he'll go elsewhere. So if you were just available, then maybe he won't go elsewhere. I mean, that buys into a gendered norm of entitlement to sexual access and contact at all times. So just being really, really mindful of what we're doing. And this is really the beginning of a journey for me into learning how to interconnect these worlds. So my reflections are quite raw and not fully thought through. And I'm not a very, theoretical, analytical person. So it will take time to filter down, but I'll be interested maybe to connect back in when I've had more time to think about these things. The final reflection I had was, as an Irish person, having grown up in Ireland and gone to school in Ireland, and I suppose the best way I can put it is not receiving comprehensive sexual health education, if I'm honest. And one day I was at a session, and the panellists were Graça Machel, Cameron Diaz, and Ambassador Burks. So pretty heavy hitters. And they were being moderated by an amazing young woman from Honduras. She was 26, and it was one of the panels that was kind of focusing in on youth, and yet youth were conspicuously absent from the formal talks. So I suppose my message is be mindful of how we effectively invite people into spaces. And at the end of this session, a young woman stood up and she asked a question of our three high-level panelists, and I was intrigued by this question, so I'm going to bring this question to the room today. Have you ever had to be tested for HIV? And if so, what did it feel like? What were you thinking? What were you feeling? Take a moment. And she then invited them, if they felt comfortable to share whether they had or they hadn't been tested, and if so, what it had felt for them. Cameron Diaz answered very openly that on 2 occasions in her life she has sought out testing. Her quite simple explanation was, I'm a woman and I'm sexually active, so yes, I've been tested for HIV. Ambassador Burks chose not to answer it, absolutely fine, and Graça Michelle spoke to say that she had also been tested as part of a campaign to show that older people are too vulnerable. It was quite clear that it wasn't because she felt she needed to. But I just thought it opened up that space of thinking through. We go out in our programming and we talk about, testing, get tested. But how often do we sit back and think, how might that feel? What might be happening for someone in that moment? And that's quite interesting, I think, to begin to think into. The last reflection in this section of what I'm going to present today was when I was walking through the Global Village. The Global Village is this really energetic, active place. It's like the fringe events to the conference, and this is where youth were very strongly. And I was walking along, I'd been to meet with a partner and going through the programs, and I was thinking, okay, where do I go next? And I'm coming down, and there was this stand that caught my eye. It was a really big stand, and there was little tiny stews, and people were sitting face to face quite closely, and they seemed to have cards. And I kind of just hesitated, and suddenly someone jumped on me. Would you like to come and take part in our speed dating? And I was like, what's that? We're talking about sex and sexuality. I was like, oh God, no, I'm Irish. And I literally had that and thought, wow, how well equipped are we to navigate these conversations? And yet we expect the youth in our world, you're starting off in a relationship, have you gotten tested? Any of us, think about that. How well equipped are we to navigate those conversations? She was American, of course. She burst out after. She was going, go on, come on. No, actually, I would love to, but I have a meeting I really need to be at. I'm 41 years of age, lads. Should I not be able to openly have these conversations? But it's a legacy of my upbringing, so it is. We don't talk about it, or maybe just with our best friend, but it just was really interesting in terms of stepping back and saying, what are we expecting people? And then, what are we expecting people that are perhaps experiencing multiple vulnerabilities in their life? So if we think of that in terms of somebody, a young girl, early forced marriage, how can she begin to navigate and negotiate that space around safety, around HIV transmission? Not a hope, guys, effectively, is the bottom line. So we reflect on some of those, if you will. Two key events that I'm going to focus on. And the first is and the reason I'm going to focus on this because it was one of the things that HIV criminalisation. Huh? Are you for real? So, I went to a one-day event on HIV criminalisation. I'm going to read a quote, and those of you who are long-time veterans in the HIV world will probably immediately know who this comes from. Since the beginning of the HIV epidemic, 35 long years ago, policymakers and politicians have been tempted to punish those of us with and at risk of HIV. Sometimes propelled by public opinion, sometimes themselves noxiously propelling public opinion. They have tried to find in punitive approaches a quick solution to the problem of HIV. One way has been to use HIV criminalisation. Criminal laws against people living with HIV who don't declare they have HIV, or to make potential or perceived exposure of transmission that occurs when it is not deliberate, that is, without malice or aforethought criminal offences. Anyone guess who said that? Justice Edwin Cameron, a long-time advocate on the issue of HIV/AIDS and a judge at the Supreme Court level in South Africa. And again, at the event that we attended, the Irish ambassador, he spoke, and again, just so powerful to hear him speaking. And he speaks quite honestly to the fact that for him, he's living positively. I'm not saying anything that's not publicly known. And he knows that he can step into that space and speak because he's white, he's earning a good salary, he's got a good job, and he recognises all of those privileges that make it easier to do that. But equally he recognises that his privileges give him access to treatment. you know, and did from an earlier point than most people would have had access to treatment. And it is only because of that that he is alive to speak and is a really, really strong advocate. The issue with laws that criminalise HIV is they're very broad, so they are. Either in their explicit wording or in the way that they're interpreted and applied. And it makes people who are living with HIV, as well as those perceived to be at risk, extremely vulnerable to human rights violations. So they're very problematic laws. Many allow for acts that constitute none or very little risk of transmission. They don't understand the science themselves, so they don't. They fail to recognise condom use or low viral load, viral suppression as transmission preventative strategies. And really, I suppose the bottom line is they're based on myths, misunderstandings of HIV and of how it can be transmitted. I suppose that brought me back to thinking about 2005, delivering a training on HIV in Darfur to the staff of concern that I was working with at the time, and thinking, God, are we still living in a world that believes some of these things? You know, it's interesting. But if we look globally, there's 72 countries that have adopted laws that specifically allow for HIV criminalisation. And those countries aren't just the countries that we're working in Trocaire. The United States of America, across the majority of its states, has criminalised HIV. Canada, Australia, and some of the Nordic countries as well. So it's really interesting. Of those 72 countries, in 61 countries, they have pursued prosecutions for non-disclosure, potential or perceived transmission. My final point on this, before I bring you some more personal stories that spoke to us in this day, is that HIV criminalisation reinforces stigma for all people living with HIV and AIDS. It decreases the potential to access services because of risks and fears it creates, and that's before we even get to the human rights violations. So it impacts everyone. It also disproportionately impacts on women and girls. Okay? Women and girls are frequently the first person within a heterosexual relationship that will know their HIV status in the countries that we're working in. Why is this? Because they interface with health services, because there's routine testings and screenings, and equally because of their vulnerability due to gender inequalities, they may be less able to then disclose onwards, but yet we expect people when they're diagnosed as being HIV positive to share that with their intimate partners. But for women, they may already be experiencing violence and therefore not able to disclose it without fear of reciprocal violence, or equally the disclosure may become a driver for violence against them. In relation to HIV criminalisation, one woman spoke from Uganda, and I found everything really interesting. I'll just keep saying that. I found everything really interesting, so I did. But her experience was she disclosed to her husband at the time when she found out that she was positive, and they continued to live in an intimate relationship with their children. He knew absolutely about her status, and at a later point in their relationship, when he had made a decision that he wanted to leave the relationship, he invoked the criminal legislation and he charged her with non-disclosure. So it can be used as a tactic of abuse. I mean, that's what I would understand that as. And I worked in the world of domestic violence for many years here in Ireland. And you know, one thing is that we have to remember that abuse doesn't always end when a relationship ends, and it can be, different things can be invoked after a relationship, and HIV criminalisation is one of those things. It can be invoked at any point in time. So he went and he put the charges against her that she hadn't disclosed. How could she prove that she had disclosed? She had disclosed within the intimacy of a relationship. He had chosen not to be tested at the time. He had since been tested when he had entered into a relationship with another woman. He was HIV positive, so he was charging his former wife with the transmission of it. So I think it's really important that we begin to understand the nuances between it. At this event, we heard from 3 people who have been directly impacted by HIV criminal laws. The first was Kerry Thomas, who phoned in from behind the walls of a prison in Idaho via satellite phone. Kerry is a male, and he is serving 2 consecutive 15-year sentences for having consensual sex with condoms and an undetectable HIV viral load with a female partner.
What country is it from?
Idaho, in the United States. Idaho. 30 years. He spoke of his grandchild that he has yet to meet. He spoke of his compassion and his empathy across the phone. This is what happened on the day too, lads. There were lots of tears in German. Was amazing. He of course knew that he had lost so much because of this, but what he was looking for was fairness. It was equality. It was for people to understand. And there was a huge sense of compassion and understanding from the guards in the prison, who had allowed him to get up in the middle of the night and had let him use the phone in their room. And they understood that there was something fundamentally not right in this, that this person didn't deserve to be in prison. So again, what you've got is that fundamental lack of understanding as to how HIV can be transmitted, and also to the fact that, you know, if someone has taken responsible measures, there's no intent to transmit. So how can we then charge them with that? The second speaker that spoke was Rosemary Namubiru, a nurse for more than 30 years in Uganda. She was arrested and jailed and called a killer following unfounded allegations that she exposed a young patient to HIV as a result of a needle stick injury. What Rosemary described to us was she had nursed for years. She'd gone to South Africa, she'd trained, she'd returned to Uganda. She had her family raised. She was moving towards her retirement phase of her life, and she was working in a local health clinic. She was inserting an intravenous cannula into a young child one evening when she pricked her own finger. And she went immediately, as you're meant to do. I had a needle stick injury once. And you bleed it out, you rinse it, you bandage it, and you return to your patient. She did all of that. She inserted a fresh cannula into the arm of the child, not the one that she had stuck herself with. And following this, the mother of the child demanded to know if she was HIV positive. So she was forced to take a test, and when she was found positive, she was charged for potentially transmitting to the child from the needle stick injury. And she was placed in prison, and there was a huge strategic case taken on, and it was going on at the time of the last AIDS conference, so it was. So she was in prison at the time of the last AIDS conference. She has since been released, but the words she used were, "I lost everything." She lost her respect from other people in the community. She lost her sense of self. She lost her job. Her identity, that's what I heard in that from her, was she lost everything as a result of this legislation. And the final person was called Lieutenant Colonel Ken Pinkala in the United States Army. And Lieutenant Pinkala arrived in full dress uniform, really amazing. You know, just the power of seeing, I love the old uniforms, I suppose I don't record that. Really, really powerful. But he started off by saying, "Today is the last day I will wear this uniform." I took legal advice because he knew he was taking a risk. Because just a number of weeks earlier, he was dismissed unceremoniously for more than 40 years of service in the US Army. He was he was an openly gay man living and working in the United States Army. As a part of pre-deployment screening, there's a mandatory HIV test, and he was found to be HIV positive. The Army supported him hugely with that, so he became not only an openly gay man, but an openly gay man living with HIV, and he was assigned his army duties. He wasn't deployed, and he came to work in Washington, really high level in the US Army, and he became a mentor for young officers who were living, or who were gay within the army. And as a part of that, one of the young men that he was mentoring at Christmas visited his home with his family, his mom, his brothers, his sisters, his partner, everyone. And at a later point down the road, that younger person found out that they were HIV positive, and they accused Lieutenant Colonel Pinkala of an inappropriate behaviour that resulted in them becoming HIV positive. Now, there's lots of science and lots of tests available in certain parts of the world, and they've done like all the testing. They could tell that the strains weren't connected, but he still lost everything. And that he used those words as well. He knew, and again, the power in that, today is the last day I will wear this uniform that I've worn for 40 years. It is so much a part of who I am, and of what I am, and of how I understand myself in the world. And it's been taken from me. Now, he had very strong calls for the reopening of his case, and I mean, it's been very much publicly stated that, I mean, he's dismissed without any evidence of any wrongdoing in it, but these laws can be applied and can be misapplied, and I think that that's really, really important for us to remember on it. So, needless to say, I was shocked by the issue of HIV criminalisation, and it really, and Edwin Cameron at every event, because I thought, he's amazing to hear him speak, so he is. I was just like, where's he going next? I'm there. Because the depth of his knowledge, his understanding, and of his being is just really, really amazing, and he can speak to it from a very different place, you know, but every time he talked about stigma and discrimination. The stigma and discrimination that exists in the external world, and how that can become reflected in the internal world of our beings. And we all have, you know, experiences of, if I hear something enough, am I it? Where is my sense of self with the sense that the external world is putting on me? And it's, I mean, it's really, it's hurtful, it's harmful to people. It's also a huge barrier to accessing testing and treatment, because to do so would mean a disclosure for some people. It's a huge barrier to accessing support from family, from friends, colleagues, because it creates this environment of fear that stigma flourishes in, really. In relation to HIV and GBV, just a few brief points. Anyone in the room that knows of a country where we've achieved full gender equality, stick your hand up in the air. Okay, so we're all in agreement that we don't live in a world where we've gender equality. That's a good start. So it is. So gender inequality is one of the factors that must be addressed in order to end AIDS by 2030. Okay, so end AIDS by 2030 is a big slogan these days, isn't it? We'll talk about that later, Rita.
I'm on the slide.
But gender inequality must be addressed. HIV is both a driver of gender-based violence and a consequence of gender-based violence. If I am living in a world where I am less equal and where that inequality may play out, for me, gender-based violence is the ultimate expression of inequality. That's my understanding of it. To navigate that world and to be able to negotiate safe sexual practices, when there's a power imbalance, to be able to, as a young woman living in a world where it's routine that you're married by the age of 14 to somebody who's maybe 40, I mean, the risk is increasing, so that's really, really important. And then I've mentioned the consequence, so around disclosures of HIV and resulting violence because of that. Women and girls are amongst the most vulnerable, both in new infections and also in terms of access to treatment. There's loads of statistics on this, but young women are becoming infected with HIV on an average of 5 years or more, 8 years ahead of their male peers. Okay? So in order to end AIDS by 2030, we need to empower women and girls. Bottom line. We need to do it anyway, for everything in the world, but if we want to achieve that wonderful target that we've set ourselves, which I think we should really work hard to achieve, and it would be great if we could. The other area that it overlaps with is that in high-risk groups, and I'm sure Rita will talk about high-risk groups because I heard you talking about it lots in Durban, is that very often in high-risk groups there's also very high levels of gender-based violence. Okay, so you've got that doubling up of the vulnerabilities to HIV. Biologically, as a woman, I am more vulnerable to HIV just because of how I am in my being. It is easier for me to contract HIV. If you add violence to that dynamic, it increases the risk, either through traumatic genital tract injuries, absolutely in terms of having no choice as to whether it's, well, in sexual violence it's never safe sex, but it's most likely unprotected unless someone's living in countries where they know if they use a condom they're less likely to be found out. But that's the reality. So in terms of the context where we're working, we need to be really attuned to that. Our programming, Trocare's programming, I'm talking in our programming, 6 months in, it's great, isn't it? In Zimbabwe, we have traditionally had a HIV standalone programming. And given our new focus, we're trying to integrate our HIV and gender-based violence programming really strongly. As I say, we're at the onset of that, but when we started looking at what the issues are in Zimbabwe and where those points begin to meet, the key areas that we have identified that we need to be very cognizant of, aware of, and need to be actively working on in terms of these are around the issue of child marriage, around the issue of polygamy, take that one on, around the issue of just simply negotiating safe sex. We also will be working very strongly and have done always in our HIV programming around stigma, internalised stigma and shame that people experience. We will also be working around economic dependency because we see those as key areas, and that's contextually within Zimbabwe. We'll probably find similar things but different vulnerabilities in other contexts, but we'll be doing that kind of depth of work. In relation to the polygamy, Trocaire are at the outset of undertaking a large, long-term research on polygamy in Sierra Leone, DRC and Ethiopia to see to learn and to know more of the dynamics of what's going on there so that our programming can begin to address that. So watch this space. There is a literature review done which I'm happy to share out with anyone that would like it. And then as the research comes out, watch this space, we'll be sharing that. But we need to really deeply understand the issues that we're working with and so that we're not just out there in the world and applying the same strategies. And I always think of this in terms of gender-based violence. We have a whole spectrum from gender discrimination right up to violence, and sometimes our strategies try to span the whole width. But where violence is actually happening, we may need a very different strategy to where the social norms, and some of the countries in which we're working, I mean, gosh, when you really get into it and think of, the high levels of patriarchal social norms that are there that just don't allow women to have a voice or anything. But, so we have to address it all along that spectrum, but I think we need to be really careful that our strategies are quite tailored to each piece of it. And I think that's what we need to look at when we're looking at the overlap between HIV and gender-based violence. And now I do the veil. Thank you.